So the first technique, and again, this is on the list. I'm going in order of the guide. And I'm just explaining. So when you see these images of the cards, I mean, you can kind of figure out what I did. Okay. So the first one is a background stamp. Background stamps are the larger stamps. And I used this music notes. And so they're usually a bigger and they do more background prints. And so I did that on the background and I just used a bunch of the distress inks to kind of age it. And then I stamped the truck out with, and I used some of the distress inks also to, you know, I spritzed that some watercolor technique on there. And then I used just some white pigment ink for the sentiment. The next one is blending, and I have a couple examples. So the first one that I did before is this one I showed you guys in class, this background, and that's just blending with some different colors, and then I stamped over the top of it, very simple, using, I think I used the brushes. And you can use brushes or daubers. And then this one, I actually tore the paper and I just did layers and layers to make it look like clouds. And then I stamped over it. And you can see the clouds behind the dye ink because it's transparent. So it makes it kind of look like a transparent balloon. And the next one is the bokeh effect. And that's one of the ones that I have not shown here. So I'll be showing that next week. And that's this, and this, in this particular case, I used a white pigment ink, but I'm going to actually test out some various white pigment inks. This was the Stampin' Up! Whisper White, but I did the blending technique in the background with a few colors. And then I did the white, I used a stencil. For the most part, I think I just used a stencil, and then I did drop in with a couple Q-tips, the white. So you can use stamps or stencils. I think the stencil is a little bit subtler than when you stamp with it, because sometimes you get stamp marks. And then I just did a silhouette stamp in the corner. Now, I did mask off the square of this, so I'm going to demonstrate this card, a similar card, next week. All right, the next one that I did in class is I used that Braille roller just directly from the ink pad, and I just rolled it onto some paper. I cut it diagonally and put those pieces in the corner for a background, and then I just did the stencil. I did a larger stencil design along the diagonal in the middle, and then added some sequins, and I used some foam tape to get the lifted sentiment that I printed off. This was the sentiment I printed off on the printer. So you'll see that same one on a lot of these. And then this one was the collage. So using just smaller stamps in different colors and making a collage paper out of it, like background. And then I did direct from the ink pad to paper for the darker background. And it was one piece of paper and I just cut it in half, and then I used it to border each side of that as basically like a little matting. The next technique, which is direct to paper, and I just mentioned that, I used that for that part as well. This one is direct from those little mini stamp pads from Distress Ink, and they make cute little, you know, stamp-sized cubes on there. So I just basically stamped them like a stamp, and they made a fun background. And then I added a strip of black paper underneath, and then I put these up on dimensional foam tape just to give it some dimension. Next technique is a graffiti technique. And basically you use a solid stamp. So the original stamp was this solid heart, and I just loaded it up with ink, and then I wiped it off. I did show this in class. I wiped it off with the Q-tips. In this case, I think I used Q-tips for all of it, but you could use any kind of tool or whatever just to create little scribbles in your ink, and just basically you're removing some of that ink so you get a pattern. And then I did an echo effect or shadow effect with the hello by repeatedly stamping that. You'll notice in a lot of these, I use these little strips This is just trimming paper, and then I have all these long strips, so it's just reusing that instead of ribbon. You could use ribbon too, but you could just use these little scraps of paper that you have around from trimming paper or whatever to embellish your work. So I've tried to do that a lot. The next one, and I have a different picture that's on the project online. So I'll show you, because that one I did before and I gave it away. But this is using the embossing powder, the heat emboss, and it's hard to tell, but all of the white is this shiny embossed. It's textured and shiny. And I'm going to be showing emboss techniques next month, but so you can kind of see the shine there. And then the rest of it was just blended ink. The next technique is kiss technique, and you're basically kissing two stamps together to get a second type of stamp. So I had just these round, solid rounds, and what I did was I had a background stamp that had all of this writing on it, and I would either ink up that stamp and stamp it directly on my solid stamp, and then it would create this round stamp with that writing on it. Now you could do the reverse where I could load this stamp with ink, and then I could stamp it off, like basically take the lettered stamp and stamp it on top there, and it'll lift the ink off and create some white lettering. And I actually did that in this as well, but it's harder to see. Let me see if I can show you that. So here is where I actually lifted the ink off of the stamp. I loaded the solid round stamp and then stamped the detail stamp over the top. And then this one, I loaded the ink on the lettered stamp and then stamped it on too. So you're basically sticking two stamps together and creating two different designs from that. And then I used some watercolor technique for the turtle as well. And again, I just used a strip of extra paper. And this time I kind of curled it at the ends and I put some foam tape underneath to give it some dimension. So that's so fun. The next technique is layered stamping. And in class, I showed you guys this stamp where it actually has 3 different stamps that layer together to create one design. So I used the yellow, and I used, I think, a melon color that turned orange over the yellow. And then I used black in this particular case. And so this is one way you can do it. You can also use, you can also use a similar stamp if you use one of the cling stamps, either the clear or the cling rubber stamps. You can use, if it's symmetrical, you can use the back of the stamp to create an outline, or kind of like a shadow stamp. So that blue area, and then the stamp part of it actually is the front is the wheel. So the details then lay on top of that. It's not one stamp. It's actually, well, it is one stamp, just using the reverse and then using the top together. So it's another way to do layering with only one stamp. And then I also did, in the background, I did some of that kind of watermark effect, which is another technique that I'll be talking about. All right, the next one is the reflection effect. And I showed you guys that as well with the lettering, but basically just stamping off onto a rubber, either like a rubber mat or a rubber brayer. And then you stamp onto that. And then when you stamp it back onto the page, so it's a secondary stamp, it'll be reversed. And so you can use it as a reflection. And then I also spritzed a little bit of water drops on there for some of that water effect. And then I put some white gel pen to kind of show some reflections. I did also try to use a little bit of water to soften that ink to see, you can see a little bit of the red. I kind of moved that a little bit just to add to the reflection effect. The next technique I call the scratch effect. It's kind of like a vintage effect, or it makes it look a little bit like vintage or like fabric, but basically it's just swiping the stamp on your stamp pad. So you just load the stamp with the pigment like you normally do, tapping and twisting. And then at the end, you go in one direction, you go in a direction, lift, go in the same direction, keep swiping it on the surface. And depending on the stamp pad, especially if it's a felt type, but I think it works even on the other types, but you will get this little texture of how the ink is on the stamp, and then when you stamp it, it'll show up. But it's real subtle. It just gives it a little bit of a interesting effect to the stamp, and it works best, of course, with more solid stamps. On the back, this is another example of the direct to paper, and that's using those cubes, those little mini distress ink cubes, to make that background of that stamp. The next technique is selective color. So if you think of in photography, how they'll have black and white and then the lips are red or something like that, or the flowers yellow, or there's just one thing, and it basically spotlights that item in the picture. And so this is just an example of that. This is actually a layered stamp set that has like the drink part, the glass, and then little, additives. And so I just did the outline stamp for the other ones, and then I used color. Now you could just color it or add your own embellishments to whatever it is if it's not a layered stamp, but this one happened to be, so it was easy to. And this is another one I'll be showing next week. Now I've showed you a shadow effect where you just stamp and then stamp again, just a little bit offset, and you get kind of a shadow effect because it's lighter of that ink. This is done a little bit different. This one, you actually use the white pigment ink. You stamp it down first, shift it slightly, and then use a dye ink. And you'll notice that where the dye ink doesn't land on the white pigment ink, it absorbs into the paper. Now, this is best with a colored, like a little bit like a neutral colored paper, because when you try to stamp with the dye ink on colored paper, it tends to be more dark because it absorbs into the pigment of the ink. Now you don't want to use it with a real dark colored paper, but this was kind of a gray paper. And so one side of it's going to have a little bit of a white highlight, and then the other side's going to have that dark low light or shadow. The next effect is the silhouette effect, and this is another one that I will probably be demonstrating next week. And I just did a blended effect through a stencil to get that background. It's always nice to have, a background to go with your silhouette. Usually sunsets look pretty nice. And so that's what I did. And then I just stamped a good silhouette stamp. No, not all stamps are good for silhouettes. But this, for example, these are all filled in. So they're solid stamps with nice detail. So they make great silhouette stamps. But if you have a stamp that is not filled in and you still want to use it, you could stamp an outline, and then you could fill, let's say the butterfly was just an outline of a butterfly, you could stamp it and then you fill it in with a matching ink, and you could create a silhouette out of, pretty much anything that has the outline. The next one is stamp masking. So, and I showed this one last year when I did the card making. But basically, when you want to make an arrangement of things together, like flowers or balloons or anything where they're going to overlap, if you stamp them, now this one I think I didn't use the mask at first, so I wanted to use this to show you. So if I just stamp it right next to the other one and overlap it, you're going to see the stamp outline, and it's not going to look great, right? Because these are not really supposed to be see-through. This is telling the story that this is see-through. I just happened to miss this spot. I had masked off this one, but I didn't mask off this area. And that's what I'm trying to avoid. So by masking, I basically am using, I stamp this image, I cut it out. I use my fussy cut scissors to cut out the shape of it. And then when I'm stamping, overlapping it, I just put that mask over the flower, and then I can stamp and it'll protect the area. And then what I do is I save that mask, I put it in, I store it with my stamps, And that way, anytime I want to do something like that with this, I already have it cut out. I don't have to create a new one. But this is a good example of showing you, you know, what not to do and then how it's supposed to look. It's supposed to look like it's behind it, not see-through. All right, stencils. Of course, we did stencils before too. And this is just an example of doing a couple different tones with a stencil. And also this one is doing the background page with the blending. And then I just did black through the stencil to create a background. Now this is the pigment ink on black. So it's green pigment ink. And so it kind of gives a little bit of a bokeh effect, but I don't think it's as effective on the black, but you can see how pigment ink shows up on dark pigmented paper compared to what you might find with the dye. That would just disappear if I tried to put that on there, if it was the regular dye ink. Oh, this is also stencil. So this is the stencil where I actually chose which, I didn't really lay down the stencil and use the whole pattern. I actually picked and chose which elements of the stencil I wanted, and then I had to block off the other areas. So there's two different ways to do stencils there. The variegated color is, you know, whenever you're trying to create basically blended colors. So this is, I did this one with a stencil where I just used multiple colors, but you can also do that with stamps if you put multiple colors on your actual stamp, and you can do that with markers, and I've demonstrated that in class. But yeah, you can always get variations, and I also use some variations in stamping him. I use some green and some blue right on the stamp. The next effect is Watermark Effects, and this was using the just embossing fluid. And in this case, I did dry it. Maybe I didn't heat dry it enough, because when I've heat dried it, it usually will leave the embossing part white. It'll resist it. But in this case, it actually made the little jellyfish in the background darker. So it's kind of like a reverse, like a tone on tone. And then I just used the white pigment ink to stamp over the top of all of that for that one. And again, I used some more scrap of my scrap paper. Now, there are several watercolor effects, and I don't have an example of each of them, but I have a few of them here. This is, I did a watercolor effect by stamping the turtle in a permanent ink, and then I used I used the ink like watercolor paint with the paintbrush and just painted the color in. I also did an effect here where I put the pigment right on the paper direct from the ink pad, and then I just splattered some water so it lifted that pigment because it's water reactive ink. This one, I stamped these images across, and then I masked the top and the bottom of it. And just with water, I just wet a brush and washed it there, and it lifted some of that pigment. So it moved some of the pigment that was laying there. And then this is, I think this one I believe I had loaded the stamp. I wet the stamp, and then I stamped with it, and it kind of bled out a lot. So I actually just put another stamp over the top of it once it was dry. So you can kind of see the watercolor effect beneath and then the detail on top. And then these were direct to stamp. I just used those small cubes and I rotated them, and they made these little like flowerette things. And then this was direct to paper that made basically like a solid cardstock, but it's all ink. This was white piece of paper. That is all of the techniques that I have on my guide, and I think they're all really good ones to have in your toolbox for techniques and effects that you can add to your stamping adventures.